So now we're moving into more global processes. So here's a map of global net primary productivity. You can see hotspots in the tropics, kind of all along the equator. You can see some big black places like the Sahara Desert, Antarctica, and the Arctic, and some big black places out in the ocean where we actually have pretty low productivity as well. So productivity is highest on land, and that's because light is limiting in the oceans, but it's also limited by temperature, water, and light on land. Marine net primary productivity is highest along the coasts where you get nutrients coming in from rivers. So here we have some net primary productivity per unit area. And you can see that coral reefs and tropical wet forests and wetlands are the highest, most productive in terms of per unit area. It's kind of a mix of aquatic and terrestrial habitats. But then you can see that very little of the Earth's surface is covered by coral reefs or wetlands. Tropical wet forests make up a pretty large amount. But the open ocean, even though it had very low net primary productivity per unit area, makes up the largest percent of the Earth's surface area. So if you multiply this one by this one, so per unit area in pp times how much area there actually is, then you get this one. It shows you total in pp, and it's the greatest both in tropical wet forests and in the open ocean. And then a lot of other terrestrial habitats have high NPP as well. So there is a lot of net primary productivity in the ocean. It's just spread out over a very large area. Okay, we're going to move into talking about how nutrients cycle. So if you work with a consumer here, you've got excretion and death of the consumer building up detritus in the decomposer pool, and then decomposers respiring CO2 into the atmosphere that plants can take up. And then those plants can push some material underground into soil organic material, or they can end up being consumed by the consumer. So this is kind of a general nutrient cycle. What's really cool is that the atoms that are on Earth today have been constantly used and reused as they move through these trophic systems and are suspended in air, water, soil, and rock. And so we're going to talk briefly about the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. But there are lots of other cycles too, like phosphorus and sulfur and mercury. Okay, so biogeochemical cycling, we're often interested in where are the pools of elements. How long do elements stay in those pools? What's their residence time? How fast do elements move between pools? So what are their fluxes? And then what processes move these elements around? And do any of these cycles interact with one another? And they do. So here first we have the water cycle. Okay, so we've got evaporation from the ocean, precipitation into the ocean. You've got movement of water vapor onto land by wind. You've got the rain shadows, right? So dropping of precipitation over land. You've got evaporation from the land. And then you have the movement of water through rivers, down through the river continuum concept, out into lakes and oceans. And you also have subsurface flow in the groundwater. So this is happening constantly. Every molecule of water has been on Earth being used by millions of us, of all organisms, for all time. So there is no new water. It's all old and it's been recycled. Carbon cycle is a little bit different. We have a small but important reservoir of carbon in the atmosphere, CO2 in the atmosphere. And plants take up that CO2 and respire that CO2. Okay. There's also a lot of fossil fuel use, so that's putting CO2 into the atmosphere, and land use change. And there's photosynthesis and respiration in the oceans as well. There's also some really large pools of carbon in soil and in rocks that aren't shown on this map. Here's the nitrogen cycle. So we have been adding a whole bunch of extra nitrogen to the system, to the ecosystem, to all ecosystems through what's called the Haber-Bosch process of creating fertilizer. So that's what's called industrial fixation. So we have this major reservoir of atmospheric nitrogen, and then industry through making fertilizer can pull that out of the atmosphere. Plants that are nitrogen fixing plants, actually, there's no nitrogen fixing plants, but it's bacteria that fix nitrogen within the roots of plants and within the stems of plants, can pull that nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into plant biomass. And then whenever there's lightning that strikes, small amounts of nitrogen are fixed. Are basically nitrogen is triple bonded double double atom gas. And so that nitrogen gas is broken apart through lightning. And then we have decomposition and assimilation of basically inorganic forms of nitrogen into the biomass of microbes. And then we also have the release of nitrogen back into the atmosphere through denitrification. So the nitrogen cycle is actually it's probably one of the more complex cycles, and you'll have an opportunity to learn more about that in workshop. Okay, decomposition is a really important factor, mostly because it's a key part of the carbon cycle. And decomposition rates are influenced by three main factors. So abiotic conditions, such as oxygen availability, temperature, and precipitation, but also the quality of the detritus as a nutrient source for fungi and bacteria that are doing the decomposition, and the abundance and diversity of detritivores that are present. So here you can see a boreal forest, like up near the tundra, between the temperate and the tundra, you have the boreal forest. You can see a lot of organic material has been built up in that soil and is kind of slowly decomposing, probably not decomposing very fast because it's very cold. Versus the tropical wet forest where you have almost no organic matter at the top and you have mineral soil. So almost no organic matter accumulation. So you can see the decomposition happens very fast in the tropics. And it's one of the reasons that if you burn a tropical forest, there's nothing left because there's no organic material in the soil to support the next generation of trees. So fossil fuels and CO2, here we can see carbon emissions in metric tons per year for fossil fuel use. And you can see the Industrial Revolution and how much fuels we have started burning. And that's pretty much directly, I would say, correlated, right? Pretty much in line with global changes in atmospheric CO2 over time. So burning fossil fuels moves carbon from a geologic reservoir, from oil in the ground, out into the atmosphere. And it's important to keep in mind that the carbon cycle itself is a combination of fossil fuel use and decomposition. And so, if we're seeing big shifts in decomposition rates, then that could be on par with some of the big shifts we're seeing in fossil fuel use. So we need to be watching all these things at the same time. And global warming versus global change. So global warming predicts an increase in the average temperature of the planet over time. Global climate change predicts changes in local temperatures and precipitation patterns that result from global warming. So increased frequency and intensity of storms, decreased snowpack. And because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, it's important because it accelerates global warming. But there are other greenhouse gases, and some are much worse than CO2, things like methane and nitrous oxide. So we have to watch the release of these other gases as well. And we've already seen this Keeling curve, but I just want to show it to you again. Maybe now it makes a little bit more sense that we see these peaks in NPP in the summertime, which results in the drop in CO2 in the atmosphere because plants are taking it up. And then in the wintertime, we get a peak in CO2 because we have accelerated decomposition and less uptake by plants. If we go back through and we look at, I think these are ice age trends. If we look at changes in time going back, like 800,000 years, we can see that there's been a lot of fluctuation in CO2 in the atmosphere if we go through ice cores. But what this graph doesn't do a good job of showing you is where we are today. We're way up here. So looking back, you could argue that there's been a lot of variation in CO2 through time, but we've never been as high as we are today. And in fact, this is even higher than 407. We're up to 411. So climate is changing. And 99.7% of all scientists who study climate change agree with that statement. So if we look at the population of different countries, you can see China and India have very large populations, and then we have the US. But if you look at our per capita CO2 emissions, you can see that that bumps the United States out way far in terms of total CO2 emissions. And this is something that we can do something about. We can reduce our CO2 emissions. So the last thing I'll talk about are feedbacks. So feedbacks are important when studying these phenomenon. A negative feedback is something like if you have elevated CO2, you get increased plant growth, and that plant growth takes up more CO2. So there's no net change. That would be a negative feedback. And that is something that was predicted to happen to elevated CO2 and has been shown to happen to some degree. But at some point, the plants stop taking up that elevated CO2, and then you end up with a situation that can spiral out of control. And so that's more like a positive feedback. And positive does not mean good in this case. Positive means spiraling out of control. So, for example, melting ice up in the Arctic leads to more dark ground being exposed. And that dark ground then heats up faster and leads to increased warming, which leads to more melting ice, right? So you can see how a positive feedback spirals out of control. Now, it's important that we start to study, well, that we continue to study these things out in really large scales. And so here you can see the number of days per year exceeding 90 degrees. So another positive feedback is that warmer, drier climates lead to more fires. And then fires pump a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, which leads to warmer and drier climates. So we're seeing warmer and drier conditions, and we are seeing some of these positive feedbacks really starting to occur. The last thing is that we can study the timing of seasonal events. And so because of warming, things are leafing out earlier, they're holding on to their leaves longer, changing flowering and fruiting times, which then has problems for pollinators and migratory birds. And so we're seeing some of these linked kind of community effects as well. And the best way that we can study these things across large enough scales is through the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, or the LTER network. So here you can see the different sites that belong to the LTER network. We do have some international sites as well, and some of them down in Antarctica. And we also are building what's called the National Ecological Observation Network, or NEON, and that's all just in the United States. We have both terrestrial and aquatic sites. Because of this long history of long-term research, we've been able to learn a lot about how ecosystems work. And in 2006, we established the EON, the Evergreen Ecological Observation Network, which is 40 plots that we can use to measure long-term changes in forest ecosystem processes here on campus. All right, see you next time.